already mentioned animus towards men, because a lot of people say, well, they weren't all like that. Feminism is good, but what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. I once, I was a feminist originally, of course, when I was doing my PhD and even in the early years of my teaching, although I wouldn't have defined myself primarily as a feminist, but I still was interested in gender as a category of analysis, as feminists like to say. And yeah, I don't think I ever thought that feminism had specifically gone
Right.
wrong at a
Mm-hmm.
particular point, but that is the myth that we
Whatever
hear
that
all
was.
the time. The first wave of feminism, that was
Mm-hmm.
very good. Those women just wanted equality, and those women simply wanted to have their
Mm-hmm.
chance to contribute to their society, which of course I believe in. I don't believe anyone should be prevented from making their
Mm-hmm.
contribution on the grounds of sex or
Well, when do
race
you
or
think that it
any
started?
other inborn characteristic. But, well, I think that, yeah, my argument is that unfortunately, this idea that the early feminists were good-hearted women who simply wanted equality, unfortunately, that isn't true. It may well have been that there were individual feminists who felt no dislike of men, but the movement as a whole always was a very angry movement. It always expressed the conviction that men from the beginning of time had really done nothing other than oppress and
Mm-hmm.
subjugate women for their own pleasure and profit, that men hated women, that men feared women. It's right there in 1848, if you go back to what is sometimes considered the first women's convention and the first declaration of women's rights
Mm-hmm.
at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a series of Quaker women friends of hers penned a declaration of sentiments. Their thesis in that declaration was that the history of mankind is the history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward women, having as its object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And then that's, it goes on from there in that fervid kind of manner. It doesn't admit that men ever acted to protect women and children. It does not admit that any aspect of the building of civilization, any aspect of the gender order as it developed naturally because of men's and women's different capabilities and roles, that it developed in order to protect women and children and to provide for them, or that it developed according to the basic, biologically based
Mm-hmm.
natures of men and women. It did not admit that at all. And I have not found any significant statement by a feminist since
Mm-hmm.
that time, or even earlier, if you go back to 1792, to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It also breathes the conviction that women have been oppressed and oppressed only by men, always denied their natural rights, always treated with contempt, always treated as the other, as Simone de Beauvoir declared in 1949. It's just there in every phase of the feminist
Mm-hmm.
movement. Deep anger, a special loathing and repulsion for male sexuality, a conviction that the family
Mm-hmm.
is the site of women's oppression. Early feminists, back in the 1850s, used phrases like sex slavery to describe the position of women in the family and in marriage in particular, of course. And also this conviction, as I say, of female moral supremacism, that if women ran the world, women would do a much, much better job. No recognition that men have ever
Mm-hmm.
acted with
Right.
benevolent intentions towards women.
So,
Yeah, it's quite something, and overt calls
Extermination.
for male extermination amongst feminists who are still celebrated today as leaders in the feminist movement. If you take a women's studies course, you may well read a widely admired writer named Valerie Solanas, who wrote something called the Scum Manifesto, published in 1967. Scum stood for the Society for Cutting Up Men. And she called for women to exterminate men. And she said that men were eaten up with hatred and envy of women. And because they recognized that women were superior, women had every right to hate men because men were inferior and brutish. She said that women had a prior right to existence over men, just as human beings have a prior right to existence over dogs. And she said that men were such sick, miserable individuals that eliminating
And
them
these writings
was
are
a
taught.
righteous and a
That's what
good
it's based
act.
on from
Now, she
these
was
women.
Yes, these writers are, yes, they're taught. Yeah. I was just recently reading Mary Daly's book, Gyne Ecology, the meta-ethics of radical feminism. Mary Daly was a professor of religious philosophy and theology at Boston College, a Catholic college. She was employed there for many decades before she was finally forced to retire because she wouldn't allow male students to take her upper level classes. She, in that book, which also asserts immeasurable female superiority to men and actually advocates female separatism. She thought women could only thrive if they lived completely independently of men. She cites Valerie Solanas as a particularly astute and insightful commentator on the nature of maleness. Valerie Solanas actually put her exterminationist views into practice. She tried to murder Andy Warhol and his manager and an art critic who were with him. She did
No
actually
way.
shoot Andy Warhol a number of times. Yes, with a .32 caliber pistol, she shot him, and he almost died. He was pronounced dead at the scene, but he was revised. The bullets that she fired into him pierced various
Like a
internal
girdle?
organs, and he had to wear a
Oh,
kind of one of those, like a corset, or a girdle to
nice.
keep his
Oh.
organs in place for the rest of his life. He was terrified for the rest of his life as a result of this near-death experience. Now, Valerie Solanas was mentally ill when she did this, but feminists have never expressed any particular concern about the direct relationship between her calls for the extermination of men and her actual extermination attempt. She's been celebrated. There's an admiring biography of her by a woman named Brianna Foz. She is taught admiringly. The book, The Scum Manifesto, was reissued not too long ago with a very admiring introduction by a feminist professor in the United States named Professor Avital Ronell. So, she's considered a heroine
Yeah.
of the movement. And I could spend the whole next hour boring you with more, the other feminists who have also called for the reduction of the male population. Sally Miller Gearhart is another one. And these are not just, crazed individuals in a dark corner of the internet. Feminism was decent and it was just, and it went wrong at this point. No, it was always so angry and so convinced that men are an inferior species of being that I just simply don't.